Hi, this is Patrick Horn, president of GAP. Thank you to our sponsor, Johnson & Johnson, for the support of this medication review video module.
Hi, I'm Peter Byrne, nurse practitioner based out of Lone Tree, Colorado with South Denver Gastroenterology. Today I'll be speaking on the efficacy of guselkumab in both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. We'll start with the ulcerative colitis portion. This was studied in a trial called Quasar, which was a phase 3 double-blind parallel group, multi-center, randomized, placebo-controlled trial enrolling 701 patients who had an inadequate response to or could not tolerate conventional and/or advanced therapies. Patients were required to have a modified Mayo score of 5 to 9, a rectal bleeding score of 1 or lower, and an endoscopy subscore no higher than 2. Patients were randomized in a 3-to-2 fashion to receive IV guselkumab 200 milligrams or placebo at weeks 0, 4, and 8. The induction primary endpoint was clinical remission at week 12, which was defined as a Mayo stool frequency subscore of 0 to 1 with no increase from baseline, along with a rectal bleeding subscore of 0 and a Mayo endoscopy subscore of 0 or 1 with no friability. The trial met the primary endpoint with 22.6% of patients receiving guselkumab achieving clinical remission compared to 7.9% with placebo. Clinical response, which was defined as a decrease from baseline in the modified Mayo score greater than or equal to 30%, along with a greater than or equal 2-point reduction, was also achieved. This was seen in 61.5% of patients receiving guselkumab compared to 27.9% receiving placebo at week 12. This response was evident as early as week 1 and 2, with a statistically significant improvement with guselkumab compared to placebo. Week 1 was 28.3% compared to 18.9% with placebo. Week 2 was 34% compared to 23.6% with placebo. Endoscopic improvement was seen in 26.8% of patients receiving guselkumab compared to 11.1% with placebo at week 12. HEMI, which is histologic-endoscopic mucosal improvement, was achieved in 23.5% of patients receiving guselkumab compared to 7.5% receiving placebo. Moving on to the maintenance efficacy of guselkumab in ulcerative colitis. 313 patients who achieved a clinical response in the induction study were then enrolled in the maintenance study and randomized in a 1-to-1-to-1 fashion to receive either subcutaneous guselkumab 200 milligrams every 4 weeks. This is considered the higher dose, or subcutaneous guselkumab 100 milligrams every 8 weeks, or the lower dose, or placebo. Study continued through week 44. The study met its primary endpoint, demonstrating clinical remission rates at week 44 of 50% with the higher dose of guselkumab, 45.2% with the lower dose of guselkumab, and 18.9% with placebo. 69% of patients in the guselkumab arm 1 and arm 2, so the high dose and the low dose, were also in endoscopic remission. The study also met all of its major secondary endpoints with statistical significance at week 44 for both arm 1 and arm 2 when compared to placebo, when looking at corticosteroid-free clinical remission, maintenance of clinical remission, maintenance of clinical response, and symptomatic remission, endoscopic improvement, HEMI, and endoscopic remission. Moving on to the induction efficacy of guselkumab in Crohn's disease. This was studied in the Galaxy 1 trial, which was a phase 2 double-blind, placebo-controlled study, randomizing patients in a 1-to-1-to-1-to-1-to-1 fashion to receive either IV guselkumab 200 milligrams, 600 milligrams, or 1200 milligrams at weeks 0, 4, and 8, IV ustekinumab at week 0, followed by a 90 milligram subcutaneous dose at week 8, or placebo. The primary endpoint was a change from baseline in the CDAI score at week 12, which is the Crohn's Disease Activity Index. Significantly greater reductions in the CDAI score were observed for the guselkumab 200 milligram, 600 milligram, and 1200 milligram groups compared to placebo. Major secondary endpoints were clinical remission at week 12, 53% of patients in the combined guselkumab groups were in clinical remission, compared to 16.4% in placebo. Clinical response at week 12, 65.9% in guselkumab compared to 24.6% in placebo. Endoscopic response at week 12, 35.7% with guselkumab compared to 11.5% with placebo. When looking at a subgroup analysis, looking at bio-fail patients, 47.5% with guselkumab achieved clinical remission compared to 10% with placebo. 62.4% achieved clinical response compared to 20% with placebo, and 30.7% with guselkumab compared to 13.3% with placebo achieved endoscopic response. Moving on to the maintenance efficacy of guselkumab in Crohn's disease. Adult patients with moderately to severely active Crohn's disease were randomly allocated to receive one of 5 treatment groups, with regimens consisting of an intravenous induction phase, transitioning to a subcutaneous maintenance phase starting at week 12, in a treat-through design. The first group was guselkumab 200 milligram induction, followed by a 100 milligram subcutaneous dose. The second group was guselkumab 600 milligram IV induction, followed by a 200 milligram subcutaneous dose. The third group was guselkumab 1200 milligram IV induction dose, followed by 200 milligram subcutaneous. The fourth group was an ustekinumab group, and the fifth group was a placebo group. So looking at the CDAI clinical remission, 64% of patients in the guselkumab 200 to 100 milligram group achieved clinical remission, 73% in the guselkumab 600 milligram to 200 milligram dose achieved clinical remission, 57% in the guselkumab 1200 milligram to the 200 milligram achieved clinical remission, 57% in the ustekinumab group. Looking at endoscopic response, which was a greater than or equal to 50% reduction from baseline in the SES-CD score, 44% of patients in the guselkumab 200 milligrams to 100 milligram group achieved endoscopic response, 46% in guselkumab 600 milligram to 200 milligram, 44% in guselkumab 1200 milligram to 200 milligram, and 30% in ustekinumab. Looking at endoscopic remission, which was an SES-CD score less than or equal to 2, 18% in guselkumab 200 milligram to 100 milligram achieved endoscopic remission, compared to 17% in the guselkumab 600 milligram to 200 milligram, 33% in guselkumab 1200 milligram to 200 milligram, and 6% in ustekinumab. With any additional questions, please see the GAP website.